The letter had been folded 3 times, and each fold had been pressed with a thumbnail, as if the sender had wished to leave a small private mark upon the paper before letting it out into the world. It arrived at the gatehouse of Braymount on a gray afternoon in the month of the first frosts, carried by a boy whose ears were red and whose gloves did not fit him, and it lay for the space of an hour upon the porter's shelf before anyone thought to take it up the drive. The porter turned it over twice. He held it to the window. He observed, as porters observe, that the seal was not the seal one might have expected, and that the hand upon the direction was a woman's hand, and small and unhurried. And then, because it was addressed to Miss Verity Ashcombe, and because there was in the household only one person of that name, and because that person was at that moment on her knees in the still room mending the hinge of a spice cupboard with a length of copper wire, he put on his second coat and carried the letter up himself. She did not rise when he entered. She only asked him to lay it on the bench and to shut the door behind him against the draught, for the fire had been let go low, and she was saving the last of the good wood for the evening. The porter did as he was told. He was a man of 50 years, and he had learned, during the 7 months since Miss Ashcombe had come to Braymount as a poor cousin taken in upon sufferance, that she was not to be flattered, nor pitied, nor hurried, and that if one wished a thing done well, one had only to place it near her hands and let her be. He set down the letter. He glanced once at the copper wire, which was being twisted with the small, definite motions of a person who has repaired many hinges in her life and does not consider the task a hardship. And he went out. It was some time before she opened the letter, for the hinge would not sit true until she had filed away a burr no larger than a grain of barley, and she was not a person who left a task at 3/4. When at length she wiped her hands upon her apron and drew the paper from its fold, she read it standing by the light of the still room window, and her face did not alter. She read it once, she read it again, she refolded it upon the same 3 creases the sender had made, and she placed it in the pocket of her apron beneath the copper wire and the file, and she went out to the kitchen to see about the bread. And that would have been an end of the matter for the day, and for the evening, and for the whole of the winter, had not the letter contained within its 4 small paragraphs the whole of what would afterward be called at Braymount, in a lowered voice, the affair of the strangers, and had not everything that came after begun in that hour, though no one then living in the house could have named it so. To understand what the letter said, and what it did not say, and what it undertook to conceal, one must first understand the debt. There had once been an estate at Ashcombe End, some 36 miles from Braymount by the West Road, and upon this estate Verity Ashcombe had been born, and there her mother had died when she was 10 years old, and there her father had for another 12 years pursued, with a slow, courteous, unshakable determination, the ruin of every acre he had inherited. He had not been a wicked man. He had been what is worse, in the practical management of land, a man of soft heart and softer judgment, whose signature at the foot of a paper meant less than the last man's flattery. He had signed for a neighbor who had asked him to sign. He had signed for a cousin who had wept. He had signed, in the end, for a stranger whom he had not met above 3 times, because the stranger had spoken well of his late wife at a public dinner, and this had touched him. And when at last he lay in his bed, and Verity sat beside him with the accounts on her knee, and read out to him, in the flat voice she kept for facts, the sum of what he owed and to whom. He had smiled at her with great sweetness, and had said only that she was, and had always been, the best of daughters, and that he was sorry to leave her the settling of it. And then he had died. The settling of it had taken her 4 years. She had been 22 when he was buried, and she was 26 when at last she signed away the last field to a purchaser who had offered a fair price and paid every creditor to the last shilling and kept back for herself only her mother's writing desk, a small locked box of papers whose key hung upon a ribbon at her throat, and a black gown that had been made 3 winters before and would, she considered, do her another 2. She had asked no man for help. She had told no relation what it cost. She had, on the morning of the sale, walked once round the empty rooms of the house in which she had been born, and had touched with the flat of her hand the doorframe by which her mother had used to stand, and had said aloud to no one that it was well done and finished, and then she had gone out to the carriage that was to carry her to Braymount, where a distant cousin of her father's, one Lady Marjorie Culverton, had consented in a letter of measured coolness to receive her as a companion, upon terms that were not stated in the letter, but were perfectly understood by both parties, that she would be useful, and that she would be quiet, and that she would not expect to be introduced. She had been at Braymount 7 months when the letter came, and in those 7 months she had made herself, as she had always made herself, indispensable in the small ways that are not thanked. She kept the linen accounts. She oversaw the still room. She read aloud to Lady Marjorie in the evenings, in 3 languages when the old woman's mood required it, for Verity's father, in the years before his softness had eaten his judgment, had been a scholar of some repute, and had taught his only daughter as he had been taught himself, without regard to her sex or her future, so that she could construe a page of Cicero at sight, and follow a lecture in French, and stumble creditably through the harder Italian, and knew, moreover, the Latin of the physicians and the Latin of the lawyers, and could tell the one from the other by the second sentence. None of this was known at Braymount. Lady Marjorie had been given to understand that her cousin's daughter had had a plain country education, suitable to her present station, and Verity had not corrected the impression. She had learned, in the 4 years of the settling, that a woman who is known to understand more than is thought proper is not the more respected for it, but the less trusted, and she had determined, upon coming to Braymount, that she would be underestimated by every person in the house, and that she would find in this a kind of freedom. The letter, then, it was from an attorney in the county town, one Mr. Peverell, whom she had used in the last of the sales, and it informed her, in language so careful that a less patient reader might have missed the sting of it, that a gentleman of her acquaintance had lately been making inquiries as to her present residence, and had lately been shown certain papers relating to the estate of Ashcombe End, and had lately expressed himself, in Mr. Peverell's hearing, as being not entirely satisfied with the account rendered at the time of the sale. Mr. Peverell did not name the gentleman. He wrote only that she would perhaps recall the person to whom he alluded, and that he considered it his duty to inform her that this person had within the last fortnight taken lodgings at the inn at Braymount village, in company with a second gentleman, his elder brother, and that both were understood to be pursuing the acquaintance of Lady Marjorie Culverton, and to be expected at the house within the week. He was, he wrote, her obedient servant, and remained so, and he had drawn under his signature a single short line, which she understood at once to mean that he would say more if she came to him, and would not commit it to paper. She stood a long time at the still-room window after she had read this the second time. The light had begun to fail. The yard beyond the window lay under that particular gray which comes at 4 o'clock in November, when the day has gone, but has not yet consented to be night. She thought of her father, and of the softness of his hand upon the coverlet, and of the paper he had signed for the stranger who had spoken well of her mother, and she thought of the sum that had been paid for Ashcombe End, and of the man to whom Mr. Peverell now, in his careful shorthand, alluded. She had settled that account. She had settled it at cost. She had walked away with a writing desk and a locked box and a black gown, and had considered the ledger closed. That any man should now come, at his leisure, 36 miles across the county, to reopen it, was a thing she had not permitted herself to expect. And the not having expected it, she saw now, had been a kind of hope, and hope, she had been taught by her father's bed, was the most expensive of the household goods. She stood at the window until the yard was quite dark. Then she went in to see about the bread. They came upon the Thursday. The elder was announced first, being the elder, and being also, as Lady Marjorie observed with satisfaction to her woman that morning, a duke, and the younger followed him, being merely a lord and a brother, and being besides some 4 years his junior, a lean, quick, dark-eyed man of 36, who wore his coat as if he had been born inside it, and who bowed to Lady Marjorie upon the threshold of the drawing-room with an inch less inclination than was strictly civil, and made it appear a compliment. The Duke, who was called Ravenhurst, was of another temper altogether. He was tall, and grave, and slow, and he came into the room as a man comes into a church, in which he is not certain he is welcome. He bowed correctly. He took the seat that was offered. He said, in a voice which was low without being soft, that Lady Marjorie was very good, and that his brother had been importuning him these 3 months to make the journey, and that he was glad, at last, to have made it. And he looked, without appearing to look, at the woman who stood behind Lady Marjorie's chair, with a shawl in her hands, and who was, he had been told at the door, the companion of the house. Verity had had 3 days to prepare her face, and she had prepared it. She curtsied when Lady Marjorie named her, in the abbreviated manner permitted to a poor relation upon whose introduction no time was to be lost, and she did not raise her eyes above the level of the Duke's watch chain, and she did not, by so much as the movement of a finger, betray that she had ever heard the name of Ravenhurst before. It was well done. It was so well done that the Duke, who was a man of quick perception under a slow manner, was not entirely deceived, but he said nothing, and he looked away, and he addressed himself to Lady Marjorie upon the subject of the road from the county town, which was, he said, in worse repair than he remembered. His brother, meanwhile, had crossed the room to the fire, and had turned his back to it, and had begun, in that quick low voice which is the private voice of families, to speak to the Duke over the head of the little table between them, and he spoke, as Verity heard within 3 sentences, in Latin. It was not the Latin of the physicians, it was not the Latin of the lawyers, it was the Latin of a schoolroom, correct and rapid and pleased with itself, and it was employed, as she understood at once, upon the plain assumption that no one in the room besides its 2 speakers could follow a word of it. The brother, whose name she now gathered, was Lord Adrian, was describing, with the cool amusement of a man who has been at some pains to inform himself, the appearance and manners and probable circumstances of the companion of the house. He observed that she was thinner than had been reported. He observed that her gown had been turned. He observed that her hands, though clean, were the hands of a woman who had been lately at work upon something with a file, and he offered it as his opinion, in a phrase drawn neatly from a passage of Terence, that the mouse had at last come out of the wainscot, and that she was, upon inspection, rather less formidable than the country attorneys had made her out. The Duke did not laugh. The Duke did not, indeed, answer at all for the space of some seconds. And then he said, in the same tongue, and in a voice so quiet that only his brother and the woman behind Lady Marjorie's chair could have heard it, that he would thank Adrian to remember where they were, and to whom they had come, and that the business between himself and Miss Ashcombe was his own, and not to be made sport of at a stranger's fire. Adrian shrugged, and turned upon his heel, and made some pleasant remark to Lady Marjorie upon the coldness of the season, and Verity, standing behind the chair with the shawl folded upon her arm, permitted herself the smallest possible inward smile at the Duke's rebuke of his brother, and permitted herself nothing else. She had understood every word. She would not, she had already resolved, permit either of them to know that she had understood a syllable. The knowledge was worth more to her, at that moment, than any satisfaction she might have had by lifting her eyes and answering them in their own tongue, for a woman who is thought to be deaf hears a great many useful things, and a woman who is thought to be ignorant is told a great many truths that would otherwise be kept from her, and she had learned long ago that dignity was best defended, in a hostile house, by the small, unshowy weapon of an unbetrayed mind. We will take a very short break here. If you are enjoying this story, please take a moment to subscribe so you will not miss what happens next. The world had changed, though nothing in the drawing room appeared to know it. Lady Marjorie went on speaking of the roads. The Duke went on answering her. Lord Adrian went on standing at the fire and turned once to look at Verity with the faintly interested eye of a man appraising a piece of furniture whose value he has not yet quite decided, and Verity went on standing behind the chair and folded the shawl the other way and said, when she was addressed, that she would fetch fresh candles, and went out. In the corridor she paused a moment with her hand upon the wall. The wallpaper there was of a pattern of small green leaves, and she counted, without looking, 6 leaves from the corner to the door of the still room, as she had counted them every day since she had come to the house, and she found the counting steadying. She had, she told herself, been foolish to hope that the debt was closed. She had been more foolish still to hope that the debt was clean. There was a thing behind this visit which Mr. Peverell had not written, and which Lord Adrian had not said, and it was not a thing about roads or acquaintance or the coldness of the season. It was a thing about Ashcombe End, and about the papers her father had signed, and about the sum that had been paid, and about the man who had spoken well of her mother at a public dinner, and it was, she perceived, a thing which the Duke did not wish his brother to speak of at a stranger's fire, which meant that the Duke knew more of it than he had told, and that the brother knew less than he supposed, and that whatever was to be settled between the 3 of them would be settled in a room in which she must first be admitted, and she had already resolved, standing there with her hand upon the small green leaves, that she would be admitted upon her own terms and no other. She fetched the candles. They stayed to dinner. It had not been asked. It had been arranged, in that noiseless way in which Lady Marjorie arranged things, by a lifted eyebrow at her housekeeper and a fractional inclination of the head toward the Duke, and the housekeeper had gone away and had laid another 2 covers, and had spoken sharply in the kitchen to the girl who was slow with the sauce, and the sauce had been ready in time. Verity did not sit at the table. A poor cousin at Braymount did not sit at Lady Marjorie's table when guests were present. She carried the tray of glasses to the sideboard, and she stood in the corner behind the screen from which the housekeeper managed the service, and she watched. She watched the Duke, who ate little and drank less, and spoke when he was spoken to, and looked twice, in the course of the meal, at the screen behind which she stood, as if he had heard something there which he could not account for. She watched Lord Adrian, who spoke well and often, and made Lady Marjorie laugh 3 times, and told a story of a horse at Newmarket which had been sold twice in one afternoon to 2 different men, and told it so lightly that no one at the table, except perhaps the Duke, remarked that the point of the story was that a certain kind of gentleman may be cheated by a certain kind of dealer without ever discovering it, and that the dealer had afterward gone into another line of business altogether, and had prospered. And she watched Lady Marjorie, who was pleased and who was flattered and who was, Verity understood with a small pang of pity for the old woman, being courted at her own table, without knowing yet whether the courtship was of herself, or of her house, or of the woman behind the screen, and who would be told, in due course, whichever answer suited her guests best. When the cloth was drawn and the ladies had withdrawn, that is to say, when Lady Marjorie had withdrawn to her chair by the drawing-room fire, and Verity had withdrawn to the small table by the door with the work-basket, the two brothers remained some time over their wine. The doors between the rooms had not been quite closed, for the housekeeper had gone in and out with the coffee, and had not troubled to draw them to, and Verity, sitting with a piece of white work upon her knee, heard again, at intervals, the same schoolroom Latin drifting in with the smell of the fire. Lord Adrian was making, this time, a longer speech. He was of the opinion, he said, that the affair need not be prolonged, that the woman was, so far as he could judge, without protector or counsel, that she had signed everything at the sale that had been put before her. That if any question were now raised as to a particular parcel of land, or as to a particular sum, it would be raised against her single word alone, and that his brother had only to name the terms upon which he wished the matter closed, and the thing would be done by Sunday, and they might be back in town before the first snow. He observed, further, that the woman appeared to him a person of sense. That sense in a woman of her station commonly went by the name of resignation, and that she would, he did not doubt, prefer the certainty of a small allowance to the uncertainty of a public quarrel with a duke. It was well said. It was said with the easy confidence of a man who had done this kind of thing before, and had prospered like the dealer in the story. And when he had done, the duke did not answer for some time, and when at length he did answer, it was not in Latin, but in plain English. And his voice was so low that Verity, straining, caught only the shape of it and not the words. She did not need the words. She had heard enough. She bent her head over the whitework and set 3 neat stitches, and considered, with the same cool, practical attention she would have given to the mending of a hinge, what was now to be done. She could go to Mr. Peverell in the morning. She could not go to Mr. Peverell in the morning without a pretext, for Lady Marjorie did not send her companion into the county town alone, and any pretext she named would be reported at once to the visitors. She could write to Mr. Peverell. A letter given to the porter would be read at the gatehouse before it left the drive, for the porter, though a good man, was Lady Marjorie's man. And Lady Marjorie, though she did not know it, was at this moment the Duke's. She could say nothing, and wait, and let the brothers propose their terms, and refuse them, and endure whatever followed. Or she could do the thing which, upon the instant of hearing Lord Adrian speak of the small allowance, she had known she would do, and she set another stitch and drew the thread through, and resolved upon it. She would let them believe, for as long as they cared to believe it, that she understood no Latin. She would let them believe that she had signed everything at the sale without reading it. She would let them believe that she was without protector or counsel, and that sense in a woman of her station went by the name of resignation. And she would, meanwhile, take out from the locked box at her throat the papers her father had kept, and which she had never yet been forced to read to any man, and she would learn them by heart against the day they were needed, and she would count, in the still room in the evenings, what she knew of the Duke's business, and what she knew of the brothers, and what she knew of the man who had spoken well of her mother, and she would wait to be told, in a tongue not meant for her, the very thing they wished most to keep from her. It was not a plan of any grandeur. It was the plan of a woman who had settled an estate at cost, and who understood that the first act of any settlement is to make the other party speak first, and to hear him out, and to say nothing at all until he has said everything. It was upon that resolve that she went up to her room that night, and it was upon that resolve that she rose the next morning, And it was upon that resolve, held quietly in the pocket of her apron beside the copper wire and the file, that she carried the tray of chocolate up to Lady Marjorie's dressing room and found the Duke of Ravenhurst already waiting there, standing at the window with his back to the door and looking out upon the yard where a groom was walking a lame horse in a slow, patient circle, as if he had been waiting for her and not for Lady Marjorie, and had known, though he could not have known, that she would be the one to bring the tray. He turned when she came in. He did not bow, for a duke does not bow to a companion who is carrying a tray, but he inclined his head by the exact fraction which acknowledges that a room contains a person, and he said, in his low voice, that Lady Marjorie had sent word she would be down in a quarter of an hour, and had asked him to wait, and that he was sorry, he added, to have kept Miss Ashcombe from her work. It was correctly said. It was so correctly said that a less watchful woman would have taken it for a mere civility, but Verity, who had spent the night with her father's papers spread upon her counterpane, and who had risen at 5, and dressed by candlelight and drunk cold water for her breakfast, heard in it the small, measured effort of a man who has decided, in the course of a night, that he will not permit his brother to be the only one to have taken her measure, and that he will take his own. She set down the tray. She said, without lifting her eyes above his watch chain, that his grace was very good, and that she had no work that would not wait, and she was going out, when he said, still at the window, and still without turning, that he had a question to ask her, if she would permit it, and that he would ask it in English, because he had no other tongue in which he could ask it honestly. And she stopped at the door, with her hand upon the frame, and she said, in the flat voice she kept for facts, that she was at his Grace's service, and she waited to hear what he would ask. He was, she saw when at last he turned, a man some years older than his brother, and grayer, and thinner about the mouth, and there was in his face the particular tiredness of a man who has been carrying, for a long time, a thing that he cannot set down. He said that he had come into Braemount upon an errand of which she must, he supposed, have some idea, that he had learned within the last month, from papers left by his late father, that a sum had been paid, some 4 years since, into an account bearing the name of Ashcombe, in respect of a parcel of land which had never, so far as his own steward could discover, been conveyed to any purchaser of his father's employment, that the sum was not small, that his father, who had been ill for 2 years before his death, had been persuaded to sign for it by a person in whom he had placed a confidence which was not, the Duke now believed, deserved, and that he had come to Braemount not to accuse her of anything whatever, but to ask her, if she would, what she knew of that parcel of land, and of the person who had persuaded his father to sign. And he added, looking at her steadily for the first time, that he understood he was asking her, in her own house, to reopen an account she had considered closed, and that he was sorry for it, and that he would not, whatever she answered, permit any harm to come to her by his asking. She stood a long moment at the door with her hand upon the frame. She thought of Lord Adrian at the fire, and of the Latin, and of the small allowance, and of the mouse in the wainscot, and she thought of her father, and of the softness of his hand upon the coverlet, and she said, in the same flat voice, that his Grace would perhaps be so good as to sit down, for the story was not a short one, and that she would tell him what she knew, upon one condition. He said, without moving, that he would hear the condition. She said that she required his word that he would not, upon any pretext, communicate what she told him to his brother, and that if he could not give her that word, she would tell him nothing, and would beg him to leave the house that morning, and would not think the worse of him for going. He looked at her for the space of some seconds. He said, at length, that she had his word, and that she should have it in writing before she began, if she wished it. She said that she did not wish it, that she had learned, in the settling of her father's affairs, to know when a man's word was worth more than his signature, and that she believed his was. And she came in, and she shut the door behind her, and she sat down upon the chair opposite him, and she began. She spoke for above an hour. She spoke as she had never yet spoken to any man, not because she was moved, for she was not, but because she had, at last, been asked a question that deserved a full answer, and she gave it fully. She told him of her father, and of the softness that had eaten his judgment. She told him of the paper signed for the stranger who had spoken well of her mother. She told him of the day upon which she had first understood, sitting at the desk in the library at Ashcombe End, with the accounts open before her, that the estate could not be saved, and could only be paid. She told him of the 4 years of the settling, and of the creditors who had been kind, and the creditors who had not, and she told him, at last, of a certain parcel of land upon the western boundary of Ashcombe End, which had been conveyed, upon her father's signature, and by the hand of the same trusted person whose name she now for the first time pronounced aloud, into the possession of a purchaser who had never come to view it, and had never sent a steward, and had never, so far as she had been able to discover in the 4 years since, done anything with it whatever. She had, she said, considered the matter at the time. She had made inquiries. She had been told, by the trusted person, that the purchaser was a private gentleman who preferred not to be troubled with correspondence, and she had, being then 22 and much occupied with the settling, taken the answer and passed on. She was, she said, no longer 22, and she was no longer occupied with the settling, and if his grace had come to ask her what she knew of that parcel, she would answer him that she knew what any woman knows who has been lied to under her father's roof, and had been too young and too tired to press the liar for the truth, and had been ashamed of it ever since. She had not been ashamed of the debt, she said, nor of the sale, nor of the black gown. She had been ashamed of that one parcel, and of the 4 years of not having gone back to it, and she was, she supposed, being punished for the shame now, by his grace's asking. She was glad, she added, that it was his grace who had come, and not another. She did not say why. He did not ask. He sat some time in silence when she had done. He said, at length, that she had told him more than he had hoped, and less than he had feared, and that he understood, from what she had told him, several things which he had not understood before he came into the room, and that he would ask her leave to sit with the matter a day, and to speak with her again upon the morrow, at the same hour, in the same room, if she would come. She said that she would come. He rose. He went to the door. He turned there, with his hand upon the frame where hers had been, and he said, without looking at her, that he owed her an apology for a thing which had been said in her hearing the previous evening, in a tongue she was not supposed to understand, and that he did not know whether she had understood it and would not ask, but that whether she had or had not, the apology was owed. And he made it, and he went out. And Verity sat a long time in the chair, opposite his empty one, with her hands folded upon her lap, and she considered that she had, upon the evidence of that hour, been very wrong to hope for nothing, and very right to trust in no one, and that the two conclusions did not, as she had once supposed, contradict each other, but were the two halves of the same practical wisdom, and would carry her, if she was careful, through the rest of what was coming. What was coming came slowly, as such things do at Braymount, where nothing moved faster than the housekeeper's temper, and where a week passed between the first frost and the first snow, as if the season itself were being deliberated in committee. The Duke stayed. He told Lady Marjorie, business in the neighborhood which would detain him some little time, and Lady Marjorie, who was pleased to have a duke detained in her neighborhood, put no questions and made no objections, and lengthened her list for dinner. Lord Adrian stayed also, though with less patience. He rode out most mornings upon a hired horse and came back at dusk in a temper he did not trouble to conceal, and he spoke to Verity, when he spoke to her at all, with the light amused civility of a man who has decided that a woman is not worth his rudeness, and Verity, who understood the compliment for what it was, answered him always in the plain English of the companion of the house, and never lifted her eyes above his watch-chain, and never, by so much as the flicker of an eyelid, gave him cause to suspect that she had heard him at the fire, or would hear him again. She was, she considered, becoming rather good at not lifting her eyes. It was a skill her father had never taught her, and she was sorry she had not learned it sooner. And meanwhile, each morning at the same hour, in Lady Marjorie's dressing-room, she sat down opposite the Duke, and they went, page by page and name by name, through the papers of the settling of Ashcombe End, and she read out to him, in the flat voice she kept for facts, what she had at 22 been too tired to press, and he wrote down, in a small neat hand upon a small neat book, the names and the sums and the dates, and neither of them, for above a fortnight, spoke of anything at all except the accounts. And it was in that fortnight, without any word said upon the matter by either of them, that the first grudging respect was conceded on both sides, and the first of the earned firsts was quietly laid down, the first hour in which each had trusted the other with a fact which the other could have used against them. And neither had. The mystery spine, meanwhile, tightened as slow mysteries do, by the accumulation of small proofs. The trusted person whose name Verity had at last pronounced aloud was one Mr. Latch, who had been steward to the late Duke for above 30 years, and who was still in his son's employ, and who was, the Duke now discovered upon quiet inquiry, the same Mr. Latch who had, 4 years since, corresponded with the attorney at Ashcombe, and upon the subject of a certain parcel of land on the western boundary, and who had, in that correspondence, employed the name of a purchaser who had never existed. The Duke did not tell Mr. Latch that he had discovered this. He wrote to him upon other matters, in the same tone he had always used. And he received in return the same replies, in the same steady hand, and he observed, as Verity had once observed of a boy at the gatehouse, that the manner of the letters did not quite match the words, that Mr. Latch was writing. Now, as a man writes who is not certain what has been found. It was upon the evening of the day the Duke first perceived this that he came down to dinner with a face so grave that even Lord Adrian remarked upon it, and asked whether the roads had disagreed with him, and made a joke of it in Latin, which the Duke did not answer at all, and Verity, standing behind the screen, with the tray of glasses, permitted herself, for the second time in her life at Braemount, the smallest possible inward smile. The blow, when it came upon two fronts at once, as such blows do. It came first in the shape of a letter from Mr. Peverell in the county town, addressed this time not to Verity, but to Lady Marjorie, and informing that lady, in language of great respect and greater carefulness, that certain persons in the town had lately been putting it about that Miss Ashcombe, the companion at Braemount, had at the time of her father's death concealed from his creditors a sum of considerable magnitude, and had lived since upon the concealment, and that Mr. Peverell, who had had the honor of acting for Miss Ashcombe at the sale, could not, in conscience, permit the report to go unanswered, and begged Lady Marjorie to lay it before her companion, and to ask her whether she desired that Mr. Peverell should proceed against the persons responsible, or whether she preferred, as Mr. Peverell himself would in her place prefer, to receive them at Braemount and to answer them to their faces. It was a very proper letter. It was such a proper letter that Lady Marjorie, upon reading it, sent at once for Verity, and read it aloud to her, and asked her what she was to make of it, and Verity, who had been expecting the letter for above a week without knowing in what form it would come, answered that she was very much obliged to Mr. Peverell, and that she would prefer to answer the persons to their faces. If Lady Marjorie would grant the use of the drawing-room for that purpose upon the Friday following. Lady Marjorie, who was by now sufficiently attached to her companion to be angry on her account, and sufficiently attached to her own dignity to be angry on the house's, said that she would grant the use of the drawing-room, and of herself besides, and that she would hear no more upon the matter until Friday. And Verity curtsied, and went out, and went straight to the still room, and stood a long time at the window with her hand upon the wire. The blow came second, and harder, upon the evening of that same day. Lord Adrian had ridden into the village. He had returned in a temper more marked than usual, and he had gone at once to his brother's room, and had shut the door, and it was not until an hour later, when Verity was crossing the upper corridor with a candle, that she heard, through the door, the same schoolroom Latin she had first heard at Lady Marjorie's fire. Lord Adrian was speaking rapidly. He was telling the Duke that he had learned in the village a curious thing, that a certain Mr. Latch, whom his brother would perhaps recall, had been at Braymount upon the previous day, and had spoken privately with the porter at the gatehouse, and had left with the porter a small sealed packet to be delivered, upon a signal, to a person in the house whose name he had refused to give, and that the porter, being an honest man and a stupid one, had told him this in the tap-room, over a glass of ale which Lord Adrian had bought him, upon the understanding that it was a secret. He proposed, Lord Adrian said, to intercept the packet before the signal was given, and he proposed, further, to do so without informing the Duke, whose scruples upon such matters he had long thought excessive, and he was telling the Duke of it now, only because he had, upon reflection, decided that the packet was more likely to concern Miss Ashcombe than any person else in the house, and that if it concerned Miss Ashcombe it concerned, indirectly, the affair upon which they had come, and that the Duke had better be informed. He put it, in his easy way, as a favor. The Duke answered nothing for the space of some seconds, and then he said, in English, and in a voice so cold that Verity in the corridor felt the cold of it through the wood, that he would thank his brother to leave the porter alone, and to leave Mr. Latch alone, and to leave Miss Ashcombe alone, and that if any packet were to be intercepted in that house, it would be intercepted by himself, and by no other, and that he would be obliged if his brother would understand, once and for all, that the affair upon which they had come was his affair, and not to be handled in the manner of a horse at Newmarket. Lord Adrian laughed. It was a short laugh, and it was not a pleasant one, and Verity, standing in the corridor with the candle guttering in her hand, understood in one small chilled instant that Lord Adrian had not, until that moment, quite believed his brother in earnest, and that now, having heard him in earnest, he had ceased to consider him a brother upon this affair, and had begun to consider him an obstacle, and that a man who considers his own brother an obstacle is capable of anything at all. She did not sleep that night. She sat by her window with her father's papers spread upon her knee, and she went through them once more, and she made, upon a fresh sheet, a summary in her own hand of every fact she knew and every fact she guessed, and she sealed it, and she wrote upon the outer fold the name of Mr. Peverell, and she placed it in the pocket of her apron beside the copper wire. And at first light she went down to the still room, and she was mending, when the housekeeper found her, the same hinge she had mended upon the day the first letter came, for the wire had loosened in the frost, and a thing that is not kept in repair, she had learned long ago, does not stay mended of itself. Friday came. The persons from the town came with it, in a hired chaise, and were shown into the drawing-room at 11 of the clock, and were received by Lady Marjorie in her second-best cap, and were kept standing by Lady Marjorie for the space of some minutes while she inquired after their journey with the particular slow civility she reserved for persons of whom she did not think well. And Verity came in behind her and stood by the window and did not sit. There were 3 of them, an attorney of the town, whom Verity had never seen, and 2 tradesmen whose names had figured 4 years since in the accounts of Ashcombe End, and who had been paid in full at that time, and had signed for the payment, and who now, upon the encouragement of a 4th person not present in the room, had permitted their signatures to be forgotten and their grievances to be revived. Behind them in the doorway stood the Duke, who had been asked by Lady Marjorie, upon Verity's quiet suggestion of the previous evening, to be present as a witness, and behind the Duke, uninvited but not to be prevented, stood Lord Adrian, with the light, amused eye of a man who has come to see a piece of sport. And behind Lord Adrian, unremarked by any of them, stood Mr. Peverell, who had ridden out from the county town at dawn upon Verity's summons, and who carried in his coat, folded into 3 by his own thumbnail, the summary she had written in the night. She let them speak first. She let the attorney of the town read out his statement, which was long, and which was full of the phrases in which such statements are full, and which alleged, in the end, that Miss Ashcombe had, at the time of her father's death, received into her hands a sum in respect of a certain parcel of land on the western boundary of Ashcombe End, and had not accounted for that sum to the creditors, and had lived since upon it. She let the 2 tradesmen speak next, and they spoke, awkwardly, and with their eyes upon the carpet, and repeated what they had been told to repeat, and would not meet her look. She let Lady Marjorie ask them, in her slow, civil voice, whether they had themselves received full payment at the time of the sale, and heard them answer, both of them, that they had. She let the attorney of the town explain, hastily, that the matter was not one of their own payment, but of the general injury done to the creditors as a body. And she let Lord Adrian, from the doorway, in the tone of a man supporting a friend, suggest that the matter might yet be composed without unpleasantness, if Miss Ashcombe were prepared to be reasonable. And then she spoke. She spoke, as she had spoken to the Duke a fortnight before, in the flat voice she kept for facts, and she spoke for perhaps 20 minutes, and she was not interrupted. She said that the sum alleged had been paid, 4 years since, into an account bearing the name of Ashcombe, by a purchaser whose name had been given to her at the time as one Mr. Halbert of the northern counties, that no such person, so far as she had been able to discover, had ever existed, that the sum had been drawn out again, within a fortnight of its being paid in, by a person acting upon a power of attorney signed by her father in the last month of his illness, when he could no longer read what he signed, that she had, at 22, been too tired and too green to press the matter, and had accepted the account rendered, and had reproached herself for it ever since, that she had, within the last month, been given occasion to reopen it, that she had reopened it in the presence of a witness whom she now begged leave to name, and that she was prepared, if Lady Marjorie permitted, to name also the person who had drawn the sum, and who had spoken well of her mother at a public dinner, and who had, she believed, encouraged the present gentleman to bring their complaint. She named him. It was the name of Mr. Latch. She named him without heat and without emphasis, and she did not look at Lord Adrian when she named him, but the Duke, standing in the doorway, looked at his brother, and the 2 tradesmen looked at each other. And the attorney of the town, who had not been told this part, went a shade paler about the mouth, and Mr. Peverell, from behind Lord Adrian, stepped forward at the small nod she gave him, and laid upon the table the summary she had written in the night, and the certified copies he had brought from the county town of every relevant page of the accounts of the settling, and he said, in his dry professional voice, that he was Miss Ashcombe's attorney, and had been so these 4 years, and would be glad to answer any question the present gentleman might have upon any point of the papers now before them, and that if they had no questions, he had 2 of his own, which he would put to them at their leisure. They had no questions. It ended, as such things end, in the diminishment of everyone who had come to enlarge himself. The two tradesmen withdrew what they had said, and were, Verity thought, sincerely ashamed of having said it, and the attorney of the town gathered his papers with hands that were not quite steady and offered in a lowered voice to convey to the persons who had encouraged him whatever answer Miss Ashcombe wished conveyed, and Verity answered that she wished no answer conveyed at all, and that she would trouble the gentleman to remember, upon his ride back, only that a woman who has settled a debt in full is not to be brought to settle it again by report. And she curtsied to him, correctly, and she turned to Lady Marjorie, and she said that she was much obliged to Lady Marjorie for the use of the room, and she went out. She had not looked once at Lord Adrian. She had not needed to. As she crossed the threshold of the drawing-room, she heard, behind her, the Duke's voice, still low, still unhurried, still cold, saying to his brother in plain English that he would be so good as to have his boxes carried down before dinner, and she did not stop, and she did not turn, and she went up to the still room, and she stood a long time at the window. He came to her there some hours afterward. He did not knock, for the still room door stood open, as it always stood open when she worked there, and he came in, and he closed it behind him, which was a thing that had never been done before. He said, without preamble, that Adrian had gone, that Mr. Latch had, upon receipt of a letter written that afternoon, resigned his employment and had left the county by the evening coach, that the papers Mr. Peverell had laid upon the table would be tomorrow in the hands of a magistrate of his own choosing, and that these matters were the smallest part of what he had come to say. He said that he had, upon the day he first entered Lady Marjorie's drawing-room, been a man who did not believe he would ever again ask any woman for anything at all, that he had believed this because a woman he had once meant to marry had died some 7 years before of a fever taken in the nursing of her mother, and because he had, at her burial, told himself that he would not risk again what he had not, in the event, been able to keep, that he had held to this for 7 winters, and had thought himself the better for it, and had understood, in the past fortnight, sitting opposite her in Lady Marjorie's dressing-room, and hearing her read out the flat facts of a life harder than his own, that he had not been the better for it, but only the colder, and that he had come now to ask her, not for her hand, and not for her word, and not for any settled answer, but for her leave to speak to her in this room again upon another day, and upon another, and upon such other days as she would grant him, until she knew him well enough to say either yes or no with a full understanding of what she said. He did not kneel. He did not raise his voice. He did not, upon the whole speech, once take his eyes from the copper wire upon the bench, and Verity, standing at the window with her hand upon the frame, understood that he had come to her, at last, as she had first seen him come into Lady Marjorie's drawing-room, as a man comes into a church in which he is not certain he is welcome. She did not answer for some time. She thought of her father, and of the softness of his hand upon the coverlet, and of the paper he had signed for the stranger. She thought of Ashcombe End, and of the empty rooms, and of the door-frame by which her mother had used to stand. She thought of the 4 years of the settling. And she said, at length, in the flat voice she kept for facts, and using for the first time in her life at Braemount the name he had been given at his christening, which was Edmund, that he had her leave, and that he might come to her in this room upon any day he chose, and that she would not, upon any day he came, pretend again to a single thing she did not feel, or to an ignorance of any tongue in which he might address her, or to a smallness she had never in her life possessed. And he heard her say it. And she saw in his face the beginning of a smile that did not quite finish, and she knew, with the practical certainty of a woman who has mended many hinges, that it would finish upon another day, and upon another, and upon such other days as she chose to grant him. They were married in the spring, in the small parish church at Braymount, upon a morning of thin sunlight and no wind, and the ceremony took the space of half an hour, and Lady Marjorie wept once, quietly, into a handkerchief which she afterward pretended to have used for a cough, and Mr. Peverell, who had been asked to give the bride away in the absence of any nearer relation, discharged the office with a dryness that was itself a form of tenderness, and observed to the housekeeper afterward, over a glass of the good wine, that he had never in 30 years of practice given away a bride who required so little giving. And that was all that was said of the ceremony, for the true matter had been settled already in the still room in the winter, and a thing that is settled well does not require to be settled again upon a public day. Lord Adrian did not come. He had gone abroad upon a small allowance from his brother's hand, and was understood to be living in a foreign city upon terms he did not describe in his letters, and to be neither prosperous nor ruined, but only diminished, and the Duke sent him, every quarter, the sum he had promised him, and did not increase it, and did not decrease it, and did not, so far as any one at Braymount ever heard, speak of him again except to say once, upon being asked, that his brother was in tolerable health, and that the climate suited him. Mr. Latch, who had been apprehended at a coaching inn some 40 miles from the county, was tried at the assizes upon evidence supplied by Mr. Peverell and by the Duke's own steward, and was convicted upon the plainest of grounds, and was sentenced, being an old man, to a term of imprisonment which he did not outlive. And Verity, upon being told of his death, said only that she was sorry for him, and asked that his widow, who had known nothing of any of it, should be provided for out of her own portion, and was. And she did not, upon any occasion afterward, speak of him with satisfaction, but only with the grave charity of a woman who has understood that the man who has ruined her life was smaller than her life, and had been afraid all his years of being found out. Lady Marjorie lived another 4 years, and saw the birth of the first child, whom she was permitted to hold upon her lap for the space of an afternoon, and whom she pronounced, in her slow civil voice, to be a creature of some promise. And she died in her sleep upon a night of no wind, having first sent for Verity and asked her, with a small unaccustomed shyness, whether she had been, upon the whole, a tolerable friend. And Verity answered that she had been the best of friends, which was true, and which Lady Marjorie, being ready to be told it, believed. And she was buried in the parish church at Braymount, and her cap was kept in a drawer in the still room, and was taken out sometimes upon winter evenings and looked at, and put back. Mr. Peverell, who lived to a great age, continued to act for the Duchess of Ravenhurst in all her private affairs until the end of his life, and refused, upon principle, to raise his fee, and was, upon the whole, the happiest man of his profession in 3 counties. The 2 tradesmen who had come to Braymount upon that Friday morning were forgiven their part in it, and were given, at Verity's quiet instance, the custom of the Ravenhurst estates upon their own respective trades, and prospered, and did not, in the remaining years of their lives, permit themselves to be encouraged by any person whatever to bring a complaint they knew to be false. And their sons, in their turn, were faithful to the house, and to the memory of the woman who had, without heat and without emphasis, refused to see them ruined for a folly that had not been of their making. The porter at the gatehouse, who had told a secret in a tap-room for the price of a glass of ale, was not dismissed, but was spoken to once, by the Duke himself, in a voice that he remembered for the remainder of his working life, and he did not tell any secret again. The house at Ashcombe End was bought back, in the 2nd year of the marriage, out of the Duke's private funds, and was not restored, for Verity would not have it so. The fields were let to a farmer of good character upon a fair rent, and the house was kept only in weather-tight repair, and was visited once a year, upon the day of her mother's burial, by the Duke and Duchess together, who walked once round the empty rooms and touched, with the flat of a hand, the door-frame by which her mother had used to stand, and did not stay to dine, but drove back the same evening. And it was understood between them, without ever being said aloud, that the house was not to be lived in again, but was to be kept as a person keeps a grave, in decent order and without display. The locked box of papers which Verity had carried from the sale was placed upon her wedding day in the drawer of her mother's writing desk in her private sitting room at Ravenhurst, and the key was hung upon the same ribbon at her throat, and was worn there until the day of her own death, and was buried with her. And the papers upon that day were burned by her eldest daughter in the still-room grate at Braymount, unread, according to a direction left in her mother's hand. The black gown was worn out in the first winter of her marriage, and was cut up for a child's frock in the second, and no other black gown was ever ordered in the house. For the Duke, being asked once what color he wished his wife to wear, answered that he wished her to wear any color she chose, so long as it was not black. And Verity, hearing him, said that she was quite of his mind, and that she had worn enough of it for one life. And yet, for it is right, in the ledger of any life, to set down what has not been repaired as well as what has, there were things that the marriage did not, and could not, mend. Her father did not come back, and was not given, by any turn of the plot, a late vindication. He had been a soft man, and had died a soft man, and lay in the churchyard at Ashcombe End under a stone she caused to be kept clean, and no cleaning of the stone made him wise. The 4 years of the settling did not return to her. She had been 22 when she began them, and she was 26 when she ended them, and those 4 years were spent, and the youth that had been spent in them was spent also, and no counting of her later happiness ever gave them back. The child that had been meant to be born by the woman the Duke had once meant to marry was not born, and the woman herself was not returned to the earth, and the 7 winters he had spent in the cold room of his grief were 7 winters, and were not undone by the fire he now sat beside. Some doors she had learned in the still room in the winter, once shut, remain shut. The mending of one hinge is not the mending of the house, and the woman who forgets it lays up for herself a second sorrow beside the first. She said this to her daughter once, in the still room, with the copper wire in her hand, and her daughter remembered it. They came to have, in the long, slow years that followed, a small habit between them, the Duke and the Duchess of Ravenhurst, which they kept without ever having named it. Upon the first frost of every year, whether they were at Braymount or at Ravenhurst or in the town, he would come to her wherever she was, and he would say, in the low voice, which he had never once raised in her hearing, that Lady Marjorie had sent word she would be down in a quarter of an hour, and had asked him to wait, and she would set down whatever was in her hands, and she would answer him, in the flat voice she kept for facts, that his grace was very good, and that she had no work that would not wait, and they would sit down opposite each other. And they would say nothing at all for the space of a quarter of an hour, and then they would rise and go on with the day. It was not a joke, it was not a ceremony, it was the small daily repair of a hinge that had once been mended, and was to be mended again upon every winter for as long as they both lived, for love, she had learned, was not a thing achieved upon a Friday morning in a drawing-room, but a thing kept, like a fire in a still room, by the adding of one small piece of wood at a time, and by the not letting it go out. And in the fold of every year, upon that same first frost, the letter that had once come to the porter's shelf at Braymount, folded 3 times and pressed with a thumbnail, was taken out from the drawer of the writing desk and was read once, standing, by the light of the still room window, and was refolded upon the same 3 creases, and was put back, and the woman who read it did not weep, and did not smile, and did not speak, but only laid her hand a moment upon the copper wire upon the bench, and went out to see about the bread. For it is a truth known to all who have kept a house in a hard country that the worth of a person is not measured by what has been done to them, nor by what they have been given, nor by the tongue in which they have been mocked, but by what they do with the small tools that lie to their hand upon the morning after. And the woman who mends her own hinge in the cold, and speaks no boast of it, and forgives even the man who broke it, has settled her account with the world, and may go in to her supper in peace. Kindness kept is stronger than cruelty spent. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and what this story made you feel. And do not forget to subscribe so you will not miss the next story.